dare you? I will do it again if you don't respect yourself.
A single sound can topple an empire, but it's the silence that follows that truly exposes the cracks. When the crack of Brielle Dawson's palm echoed through Seattle's most exclusive rooftop lounge, it wasn't the violence that paralyzed the room. It was the defiance. While every high-ranking member of the Korean syndicate sat in frozen terror, watching the most feared man on the West Coast lose his grip on a glass of splashing whiskey, an invisible waitress, a nobody with 3 jobs and a brother to protect, didn't look away. She didn't do it for fame. She didn't do it for a death wish. She did it because respect isn't a debt you pay to the powerful. It's a right earned by those who stand their ground. Tonight, Han Tae-rin, the man who controls the city's shadows, is about to face a truth that no amount of blood money can silence. He's about to learn that the heart of his world doesn't belong to his soldiers, but to the one woman who wasn't afraid to hit back. If this act of courage gave you chills, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a fearless underdog. Subscribe and hit the bell, because next week we're dropping a tale about a disgraced bodyguard and the heiress he was never supposed to love. The air in the Skyline Lounge was thick with the scent of expensive oud and aged bourbon, a sharp contrast to the biting November wind howling against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Brielle Dawson moved through the crowd like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. In this world of silk ties and blood oaths, she was invisible, a mere vessel for hors d'oeuvres and vintage wine. She kept her eyes down, her focus anchored on the tray in her hand, until she reached the corner booth where the shadows seemed to pool. There sat Han Tae-rin, the king of Seattle's underground, his face a mask of carved granite as he swirled a glass of whiskey. He was the center of a silent storm, surrounded by bodyguards who stood like stone monoliths. But it wasn't Tae-rin who made the blood in Brielle's veins turn to ice. It was his younger brother, Han Seo-jun, who was currently leaning over a trembling busboy near the service station. That busboy was Leo, Brielle's 18-year-old brother. He was supposed to be in a library, not here, but he had taken an extra shift to help with the rent. Seo-jun, flushed with drink and malice, had deliberately tripped Leo, sending a tray of crystal flutes shattering across the marble. "Clean it up, dog," Seo-jun sneered, his voice cutting through the low hum of the jazz band. He ground his Italian leather heel into Leo's hand as the boy reached for the shards. "And apologize for breathing my air." Brielle's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of primal instinct. She looked at Tae-rin, silently pleading for the man in charge to stop the cruelty. But the boss didn't even look up. He merely watched the amber liquid in his glass, his indifference more lethal than his brother's rage. "Tae-rin SSI," Brielle whispered, stepping into the light of their table. Her voice was steady, despite the tremors in her soul. "Please, he's just a kid. My brother." Tae-rin finally looked at her. His dark eyes were cold, devoid of the empathy that makes a man human. "A servant who cannot hold a tray is a servant who is useless," he said, his voice a low, melodic silk. Let Seo-jun finish his lesson. In that moment, something snapped inside Brielle. The years of being stepped on, the double shifts, the invisibility, it all condensed into a single point of white-hot fury. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a sister. The glass in Tae-rin's hand shivered as she moved. Before the bodyguards could blink, before the king could finish his drink, Brielle's hand arched through the air. Crack! The sound was explosive, a sharp, violent report that seemed to shatter the very atmosphere of the lounge. Tae-rin's head snapped to the side, his whiskey splashing mid-air, droplets landing like diamonds on his white shirt. The jazz music died. The laughter evaporated. 500 of the most dangerous people in the city froze as the nobody in the apron stood over their master, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a fire that even the Pacific rain couldn't douse. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the ambient hum of the city and the distant rain. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, heavy, suffocating, and charged with a lethal electricity. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. Han Tae-rin's head remained turned, his profile a sharp, dark silhouette against the gold-leafed walls of the lounge. The amber whiskey dripped from his jawline, staining the pristine white of his collar like a spreading bruise. Behind him, the 3 bodyguards finally broke their paralysis. In a blurred unison of shifting fabric and leather, they surged forward, hands reaching into the inner pockets of their charcoal suits. "Don't," Tae-rin said. The word was barely a whisper, yet it froze the men mid-stride. His voice didn't carry the heat of anger. It was as cold and flat as a blade drawn across ice. Slowly, with a mechanical deliberation that was more terrifying than a shout, Tae-rin reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at his brother, who stood gaping like a fish. He focused entirely on the moisture on his skin, meticulously wiping the whiskey from his cheek and chin. The only sound in the room was the soft friction of silk against stubble. When he finally turned his head to face Brielle, the air in her lungs seemed to vanish. Up close, his eyes weren't just dark, they were a void. He looked at her not as a master looks at a servant, but as a predator looks at a glitch in the natural order. For the first time in his life, Han Tae-rin wasn't looking through a waitress, he was looking at her. He saw the tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite hide. He saw the frayed hem of her uniform and the fierce, protective light in her eyes that mirrored his own dormant soul. "You have a very strong hand, Miss Dawson," he remarked, his gaze tracking a single drop of whiskey that had landed on her apron. "Most people in this city spend their lives trying to touch me. You're the first one who's ever succeeded in making me feel it." Brielle didn't back down. She stood her ground even as the lead bodyguard, a man built like an iron wall, stepped close enough for her to smell the gun oil on his holster. "My brother is bleeding," Brielle said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "That's the only feeling that matters in this room." Tae-rin leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco invading her space. A ghost of a smile, sharp, fleeting, and dangerous, tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then you've just made a very expensive trade, Brielle. You save his hand, but you've placed your entire life in mine." He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a funeral bell. "Bring her," he commanded, not looking back as he walked toward the elevators. "And make sure her brother gets home. He's finished for the night. They both are." The morning light in Brielle's apartment was thin and gray, filtering through a cracked window that rattled with every passing bus. She sat at her small kitchen table, her knuckles still throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, a physical ghost of the night before. Leo was asleep in the other room, his hand bandaged and his breathing heavy with the exhaustion of terror. Brielle watched the steam rise from a chipped mug of coffee, waiting for the sound she knew was coming. It wasn't a knock. It was the sudden, oppressive silence of the street outside. When she looked out the window, the neighborhood's usual chaos had been sucked away, replaced by 3 idling black SUVs. They sat like predatory crows against the curb, their engines humming a low, mechanical growl that vibrated in her floorboards. Brielle didn't wait for them to come up. She pulled on her worn denim jacket, kissed the air near Leo's closed door, and walked out. The man from the lounge, the one with the iron wall build and the scent of gun oil, was waiting by the lead vehicle. He opened the rear door without a word. Brielle braced herself, expecting the interior to smell like plastic and bleach, the clinical scent of a cleanup crew. Instead, she was met with the aroma of expensive leather and chilled ozone. As the convoy moved through the city, Brielle watched the familiar neon signs of her world fade away, replaced by the glass and steel monoliths of the downtown core. She expected the car to turn toward the docks or the industrial outskirts where stories like hers usually ended in shallow graves. Instead, the SUVs glided into the private, subterranean garage of the Obsidian Tower, the tallest, most guarded residential spire in Seattle. The elevator ride was a silent, pressurized ascent that made her ears pop. When the doors finally slid open, Brielle didn't step into a torture chamber. She stepped into a sanctuary of terrifying beauty. The penthouse was a cathedral of minimalism, all white marble and shadows, perched so high that the clouds seemed to drift through the living room. Han Tae-rin was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her. He had traded his blood-stained suit for a charcoal silk robe, looking less like a mobster and more like a king surveying a kingdom he had grown tired of ruling. "The coffee in your neighborhood is terrible, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the vast space without him turning around. On a low glass table sat a tray with 2 porcelain cups, the steam curling into the air like white flags. "I thought we might discuss your future over something a bit more refined. See, we have a debt to settle, and I find I'm not in the mood for traditional interest." Tae-rin finally turned, the city lights of Seattle shimmering behind him like a sea of fallen stars. He didn't approach her. He simply leaned against the cold marble of a pillar, watching her with a clinical, detached curiosity. The porcelain cup in his hand remained untouched, the steam dying down into a stagnant mist. "My brother is a small man with a very large ego," Tae-rin began, his voice cutting through the hum of the penthouse's climate control. "He spent the morning demanding your head on a platter. He believes that the natural order requires your blood to wash away the whiskey you splashed on his family name. In his world, a waitress is less than the dirt on his shoe." Brielle felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she kept her chin tilted up. "And in your world?" "In my world, I value things that are rare," he replied, taking a slow step toward her. "Fear is common. Greed is universal. But a woman who will risk a bullet to protect a busboy? That is a statistical anomaly. You are a variable I didn't account for, Brielle." He set his cup down on the glass table with a soft clink that sounded like a gavel. "Seo Jun wants you dead. If I let you walk out of that elevator right now, you won't make it to the end of the block. My protection is the only thing keeping your brother's lungs filling with air." "So what is this?" Brielle asked, gesturing to the luxury surrounding them. "A prettier cage before the execution?" "It's an investment," Tae-rin said, his eyes narrowing. "I am currently negotiating a merger with the Red Dragon Triad. They expect to see a monster, a man who rules through terror alone. But I'm trying to build something more sustainable. I need a public shadow, someone who isn't a soldier, someone whose presence reminds my enemies that I am not just a killer, but a man of the people, someone who isn't afraid to look me in the eye when everyone else is bowing." He paused, the silence stretching between them. 30 days. You will stand by my side at every meeting, every dinner, every gala. You will be my personal assistant, my witness, and my conscience. In exchange, your brother's tuition is paid in full, your debts are erased, and Seo Jun is forbidden from touching a hair on your head." Brielle looked at the city below, the world that had spent 24 years trying to break her. "And if I say no, then I step aside," Tae-rin said simply, "and my brother's justice takes its course. I won't kill you, Brielle. I'll just stop stopping him." The choice was a jagged pill, but Brielle swallowed a whole. She thought of Leo's bandaged hand and the rattling window of their apartment. She looked at the man who held the city in his palm and realized he was offering her the only weapon she had ever lacked: power. 30 days, she whispered. Tae-rin nodded, a dark, satisfied glint appearing in his eyes. "Welcome to the Empire, Miss Dawson. Try not to slap anyone else until I give the command." The transition happened not with a bang, but with the silent sliding of hangers across a brass rail. In the center of a dressing suite that smelled of jasmine and cold iron, Brielle stood before a triptych of mirrors. Watching the waitress, she had been vanished beneath layers of midnight blue silk. Gone was the stained cotton apron and the sensible non-slip shoes. In their place was a dress that cost more than a year of her brother's tuition, a garment that clung to her like a second skin, armored with elegance. The fabric is reinforced with a liquid Kevlar weave, a woman named Sora said, her voice as sharp as the pin she held between her teeth. She was Tehrin's lead stylist, though her movements suggested she knew as much about ballistics as she did about bias cuts. You are a shadow now, Miss Dawson. Shadows don't just follow, they protect. Brielle looked at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Her hair, usually pulled into a hurried knot, was now a sleek, sculpted crown. Her eyes, once tired from double shifts, looked predatory under the flick of charcoal liner. She realized then that this was just a different kind of uniform. In the restaurant, her clothes told people she was there to serve. Here, they told people she was there to be feared. When she finally stepped out into the main gallery of the penthouse, Tehrin was waiting. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that matched the brooding sky outside, his hands buried in his pockets. He didn't offer a compliment. He simply looked her up and down with the same intensity he might use to inspect a new shipment of heavy machinery. You look like someone who belongs at a table, not beside it, he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. But remember, Brielle, the people we are meeting tonight are like diners in a five-star restaurant. They will smile at you while they look for a reason to send the meal back. Every word is a course. Every look is a tip. If you miss a cue, the bill is paid in blood. He offered his arm, and Brielle took it. The silk of his jacket was cool against her skin, a stark reminder of the world she had entered. As they walked toward the private elevator, she felt the weight of the debt of honor settling onto her shoulders. She had spent years mastering the art of the invisible service, anticipating needs before they were spoken, reading the subtle shifts in a customer's mood, and managing the chaos of a kitchen. As the elevator descended toward the waiting black SUVs, she realized that the Mafia wasn't a different world at all. It was just a deadlier version of the service industry. And if there was one thing Brielle Dawson knew how to do, it was handle a difficult table. The luxury of the obsidian tower felt like a gilded cage as the week wore on. But the true danger didn't lie in the heights. It lurked in the transit between the worlds. Brielle had been sent to the garage to retrieve a forgotten file from the SUV, a task that felt deceptively normal, a lingering habit of her life as a girl who did what she was told. The subterranean levels were a labyrinth of polished concrete and humming ventilation. As Brielle reached the vehicle, the sound of a heavy door slamming echoed through the bay, followed by the rhythmic clicking of heels that were too heavy to belong to a woman. You look remarkably comfortable in silk, little waitress. A voice sneered from the shadows of a structural pillar. Han Seo-jun stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. His face was still slightly discolored from the slap, a faint yellowing bruise that he touched with a trembling finger. He wasn't alone. Two of his personal associates, men who lacked the disciplined silence of Tehrin's guards, flanked him with predatory grins. My brother thinks you're a mascot. A charm to show the triads he's gone soft, Seo-jun said, his voice rising with a jagged edge of insecurity. But I remember the sound your hand made. I still hear it when I try to sleep. He lunged forward, grabbing Brielle's wrist with a grip that threatened to snap the delicate bone. The silk of her new dress bunched under his fingers, a desecration of the image Tehrin had built. The debt of honor only covers you when he's looking. Down here, you're just a girl who needs to be taught where she belongs. Brielle didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only fed the ego of a bully. She stared into Seo-jun's bloodshot eyes, her voice like a cold shard of glass. If you touch me, You aren't just breaking a bone. You're breaking your brother's command. Do you really think you're faster than he is? Seo Jun raised his free hand, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He's not here, bitch. He doesn't need to be. The voice came from the darkness behind the SUV, low and resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to drop the temperature of the garage by 10 degrees. Han Tarin stepped out of the shadows, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his overcoat. He looked bored, yet there was a predatory stillness in his posture that made Seo Jun's associates instinctively back away. Seo Jun, Tae-rin said, his gaze fixed on his brother's hand. Count to 3. If your fingers are still touching her silk on the third beat, I will ensure you never use that hand to hold a glass, a gun, or a woman again. Seo Jun's creep fortsatt. He looked at his brother, then at Brielle, the humiliation burning hotter than the bruise on his face. He let go as if her skin had turned to white-hot iron. Tae-rin didn't yell. He simply walked over, placing himself between Brielle and the threat. He reached out, not to strike his brother, but to smooth the wrinkled silk on Brielle's shoulder with a gesture that was shockingly tender and terrifyingly possessive. Go upstairs, Brielle, Tae-rin commanded softly, his eyes never leaving his brother. I need to remind my family that my shadows are not to be stepped on. As the elevator doors closed, the last thing Brielle saw was Tae-rin's hand closing into a slow, deliberate fist. For the first time, she realized that being protected by a monster was just as frightening as being hunted by one. The rooftop garden was an island of tranquility suspended above the glowing arteries of the city. Here, the roar of Seattle was reduced to a rhythmic hum, softened by the glass partitions and the gentle rustle of manicured maples. A single table was set, lit by the flickering amber of a low candle that cast dancing shadows across Tae-rin's sharp features. For the first time, there were no bodyguards standing at his shoulders, no phones buzzing with the demands of an empire. There was only the scent of rain-drenched earth and the quiet clink of silver against porcelain. Brielle watched him across the table. He had discarded his jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms corded with tension and a faint, jagged scar that disappeared under his watch. He wasn't the king tonight. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a mountain on his back. My father didn't want this for me, Tae-rin said, his voice so low it was nearly lost to the breeze. He wasn't looking at her, but the distant horizon where the black water of the Sound met the sky. He was a man who built things, legitimate things. Concrete, steel, infrastructure. But in this city, if you build something worth having, the vultures come. He became a monster to keep the vultures away from us. He finally turned his gaze to Brielle, the candlelight reflecting in the dark depths of his eyes. He died with blood on his hands, so I could have clean ones. And yet, here I am, staying just the same. My brother loves the violence. He craves the fear. But every time I look at my reflection, I see a man failing a dead man's ghost. Brielle reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his hand on the linen cloth. Is that why you brought me here? To be a witness to the man you're trying to become? I brought you here because you're the only person who doesn't look at me and see a paycheck or a grave, Tae-rin admitted, a rare vulnerability breaking through his granite exterior. I'm moving the assets. The shipping, the real estate, it's all being scrubbed. By the end of the year, the Han name will be on the front of hospitals, not police reports. But the transition is a war in itself. My own people think I'm weak. The triads think I'm retreating. He reached out, his hand finally covering hers. His skin was warm, his grip firm but careful, as if he were holding something incredibly fragile. I don't want to be feared anymore, Brielle. I want to be worthy of the person who had the courage to slap me in front of the world. In the quiet of the rooftop, the distance between the waitress and the boss vanished. Brielle realized then that they were both just survivors, fighting to outrun the roles the world had forced them into. For a fleeting moment, The empire didn't matter. Only the truth hiding under the shadows of the Seattle skyline. The air in the private docking bay was heavy with the smell of brine and diesel, the industrial skeletal remains of the Seattle shipyard looming over them like prehistoric beasts. This was the dark underbelly of Tehran's world, far removed from the polished marble and silk of the penthouse. He stood at the center of the concrete floor, surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants, waiting for the arrival of the Red Dragon Triad's envoys to finalize the transition. Brielle stood a step behind him, her presence a silent anomaly in a sea of dark suits and tactical gear. She watched the shadows, her eyes trained by years of scanning crowded dining rooms for the subtle shift in a customer's posture. When the Triad's black sedans pulled into the bay, a group of men emerged, their faces obscured by the dim, flickering overhead lights. But as they stepped into the circle of illumination, Brielle's breath hitched in her throat. Her pulse began to thrum against her collarbone, a frantic, warning rhythm. Walking just behind the Triad's lead negotiator was a man in a nondescript gray suit. To anyone else, he was just another foot soldier, another face in a crowd of killers. But Brielle knew him. She had served him black coffee and dry toast every Tuesday morning for 2 years at the diner 3 blocks from the Skyline Lounge. He was Mr. Henderson, a quiet accountant who tipped exactly 15% and never made eye contact. Except here, he wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking at Han Seo-jun. A silent, knowing nod passed between the regular and Tehran's brother, a flicker of recognition that lasted less than a second, but in Brielle's world, it was as loud as a gunshot. Her mind raced, connecting the dots of a map she hadn't known she was drawing. Seo-jun wasn't just angry. He was desperate. He was selling the empire out from under his brother to the very people they were supposed to be merging with. Tehran stepped forward to shake the negotiator's hand, his back completely exposed to the shadow where Mr. Henderson stood, his hand resting too close to the small of his back. Brielle felt the cold realization wash over her. This wasn't a meeting, it was a setup. The legit future Tehran had confessed to her on the rooftop was being dismantled in the dark by the person he shared name with. She looked at Tehran, seeing the man who wanted to be more than a monster, and realized that if she didn't act, the vultures he feared wouldn't just take his empire, they would take his life. She shifted her weight, the silk of her dress rustling like a warning. She couldn't speak, not here, not without triggering the violence. She had to find a way to signal the king before the shadow moved. The Emerald Gala was a sea of shimmering silk and clinking crystal, a high-stakes masquerade where the city's elite danced atop a powder keg. Under the soaring arches of the grand ballroom, the air hummed with the tension of the impending merger. Tehran moved through the crowd with a practiced, lethal grace, his hand resting firmly on the small of Brielle's back. He looked like a man who had already won, but Brielle's eyes were not on the guests. They were on the edges of the room. She watched the waitstaff with a clinical intensity that years of double shifts had etched into her soul. To the wealthy donors and syndicate leaders, the servers were furniture in white gloves. To Brielle, they were a choreographed machine. She knew the rhythm of a high-end floor. The way a seasoned server carries a tray at the shoulder, the specific pivot of a foot to avoid a collision, the silent communication of a glance toward a half-empty glass. Then she saw the anomaly. Near the heavy velvet curtains of the north exit, 3 servers moved out of sync. They weren't scanning the tables for empty flutes. They were scanning the exits. One man carried his tray too low. His center of gravity shifted as if balancing a weight far heavier than champagne. His colleague didn't have the hustle of a man working for tips. He had the cold, predatory stillness of a man waiting for a signal. Brielle's gaze flickered to the regular from the shipyard, now dressed in a catering tuxedo. He was moving toward the head table where Tehran's brother, Seo-jun, sat nursing a glass of dark liquor, his eyes fixed on Tehran's back. The rhythm was wrong. The restaurant flow had been hijacked. "Tyrin," Brielle whispered, her voice a low vibration against his ear as they paused near a marble pillar. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the man with the heavy tray. "Don't turn around. The three servers by the north exit, they aren't staff. The one in the center isn't carrying glasses. He's carrying a suppressed submachine gun under that linen." Tyrin's posture didn't change, but she felt the muscles in his arm turn to tempered steel. "Are you sure, Brielle?" "I know how a waiter breathes when the room is full," she said, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "They aren't breathing for the service. They're breathing for a kill." As the regular reached into his jacket and Seo Jun stood up to leave, the music seemed to slow. Brielle didn't wait for the first shot. She grabbed a heavy silver tray from a passing real server and stepped directly into Tyrin's line of fire, her silk dress swirling like a battle flag. The waitress who had once slapped the king was now the only thing standing between him and the vultures. The silver tray caught the first light of the muzzle flash, a blinding reflection that bought Tyrin the split second he needed. The ballroom erupted, not into screams, but into the disciplined, lethal chaos of a war zone. Brielle didn't flinch when the first round dented the heavy silver in her hands. She shoved Tyrin behind the shelter of a marble column, her silk dress torn and stained with the soot of a dying empire. Tyrin's guards materialized from the shadows, their silence replaced by the thunder of return fire. In the center of the room, Brielle's eyes found the regular. He was scrambling toward the exit, but Tyrin was faster. The king moved like a shadow given form, intercepting the traitor before he reached the heavy velvet curtains. But as Tyrin raised his weapon, he looked back at Brielle. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire she had carried in that rooftop lounge, and he didn't pull the trigger. He simply disarmed the man and brought him to his knees, a silent acknowledgement that the era of the monster was over. Seo Jun was gone, a ghost chased into the night by the shame of a failed betrayal, leaving the Han legacy in the hands of the brother who wanted to save it. An hour later, the smoke had cleared, and the grand ballroom was silent once more. The city's elite, shaken but alive, stood in a wide circle, their eyes fixed on the man at the head of the room. Tyrin stood there, his charcoal suit dusty, his blood-stained handkerchief discarded. Beside him stood Brielle. She wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. Her blue silk was shredded at the hem, and her sleek hair was unraveled. But she stood with her head high, the weight of the city's gaze no longer making her feel invisible. Tyrin reached out, his hand finding hers in front of everyone, the triads, the politicians, and the killers. He didn't just hold her hand, he raised it. "Tonight, you saw an empire nearly fall," Tyrin's voice echoed, carrying a depth that commanded the very air in the room. "And you saw who stood to catch it. Most of you know Brielle Dawson as the woman who had the courage to strike me. You thought she was a servant, a shadow, a debt to be paid." He turned to her, his gaze softening into something raw and unmistakably real. "But she is the only person in this city who sees the truth under the mask. She is not my assistant. She is not my shadow." He looked back at the crowd, his voice dropping to a low, resonant vow. "She is my partner, and from this night forward, if you bow to me, you bow to her. Seattle has a king, but it finally has a queen who knows the value of a soul." As the room broke into a cautious, respectful applause, Brielle looked out at the city lights. The waitress was gone. Then nobody had vanished. In her place stood a woman who had saved a man from himself, proving that sometimes the loudest sound in the world is the silence after a slap. The story of Brielle Dawson and Han Tyrin serves as a powerful reminder that true authority is not found in a title, a tailored suit, or the fear one can instill in others. It is found in the quiet, unwavering courage of those who refuse to be invisible when the world demands their silence. Brielle's journey from a marginalized waitress to the partner of a king teaches us that dignity is not a gift given by the powerful. It is a boundary we set for ourselves. The educational value of this tale lies in the subversion of social hierarchies. It challenges the idea that those who serve are lesser than those who lead. In the high-stakes world of the Seattle Underground, it wasn't a soldier's bullet that changed the course of an empire. It was a sister's love and a worker's integrity. This story proves that when we stand up for what is right, even at the risk of everything, we don't just change our own lives. We have the power to transform the monsters around us into men of honor. If this story of defiance and redemption moved you, don't let the message end here. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly journeys into the hearts of the bold and the brave. Like and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that their voice, no matter how quiet, has the power to shatter the silence. Finally, we want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us. Have you ever had a moment where you had to find the courage to stand your ground against someone more powerful? Your stories of bravery are what keep this community growing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.